We Are Atheists is a show brought to you by volunteer atheists from FreeThought Fort Wayne Incorporated. We're looking for members of our audience to call in to tell us what they believe and why they believe it. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting group. Hello everybody, my name is Caleb, and I am proud to present to you, We Are Atheists. Now, normally this is going to be a live call-in show. However, we wanted to cook something up a little extra special for you guys for our very first breakout episode. And what better way to do that than with a debate centered entirely around creationism with one of its greatest spokespersons, Kent Hovind. Creationism, often referred to as intelligent design, is the belief that a deity was responsible for the creation of the universe. Now, there does exist a broad spectrum of beliefs that would qualify as creationism. However, Kent Hovind has become rather famous during his pursuit to advocate for a very specific particular breed of creationism. Kent, therefore, will be defending the young earth biblical creationists' perspective. And he will be doing so against our very own John Loftus and Christopher Rex. The agreed upon topic for the debate this evening reads as follows: Is there good evidence for biblical creation? Kent, otherwise known as Dr. Dino, will be defending his position, as previously mentioned, against John Loftus, a public speaker, atheist activist, and renowned author of several books, including The Outsider Test for Faith. Kent will also be debating Christopher Rex, FreeThought Fort Wayne's vice president and biologist representative for the debate this evening. The debate format will proceed as follows. Each side will have an 8-minute opening statement. There will then be 2 5-minute rebuttal rounds each. This will be followed up by a 6-minute Q&A session, wherein the questioner will have up to 2 minutes to pose a question and the interlocutor will have up to 2 minutes to respond. Finally, we will end the debate on 4-minute closing statements, with Kent Hovind getting the last word. For the record, Chris and John will have to divide their time, but they may do so however they see fit. I myself will be moderating the debate, which should take about 56 minutes should everything go well. With that said, let's not waste any time and let's just leap right into it. Kent, I wanted to thank you for joining us today. I know you're a busy man, and I do appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, thank you again. And that said, good luck, have fun. Your 8 minutes begins as soon as you start talking, and you may begin whenever you are ready.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. My name is Kent Hovind. I was a high school science and math teacher in Christian schools for 15 years, and I've been teaching all over the world on the topic of creation versus evolution for the last 30 years. I've written quite a few books on the topic and produced videos in 40 languages, and I travel all over and defend the fact that I believe the Bible is literally true and scientifically accurate. The topic we agreed on, is there good evidence for biblical creation? I think we'd have to define a couple of words. Evidence comes in several different categories, as any FBI agent or police officer will tell you. There is things that we infer based on the evidence, and sometimes it can be wrong. If you saw the movie with John Coffey and Tom Hanks, you know, the girls are missing. The black man is found holding them both dead, and he's saying, I tried to take it back, I tried to take it back. He's arrested and executed for a crime that he did not commit. So they were looking at the evidence that they had and getting the wrong interpretation. And that is always a danger of course, in any field, but in forensics, and especially when it comes to biology. I think people are looking at the evidence. We're both looking at the same evidence. We're noticing that, you know, most animals, mammals particularly, have a lot of structures that appear to be what they call homologous. We both have 2 bones in the forelimb, the radius and the ulna. We have a single bone in the upper arm, the humerus. And so I think it's a reasonable statement to say it is a fact that there are similarities in the structure of quite a few different creatures. Now, that's where the fact stops, and after this is inference. Those who choose to believe in evolution have decided to interpret that as evidence of a common ancestor, whereas those who believe in creation have said, no, that's evidence of a common designer. And I think probably the argument will never be resolved until we stand before that designer and he explains to you guys clearly that I'm right and you're wrong. So that's what's going to happen on Judgment Day. So I think we're all seeing the same evidence and coming to different conclusions of what it means. As far as biblical creation, we'll take one word at a time. Creation first. Is there evidence that things were created? If you're walking through the woods and you find an arrowhead, I think it is just intuitive to look it up, and pick it up, and even though it's not anything other than rock, I mean, it's normal, natural material, it has been shaped and designed for a purpose. And so the logical conclusion from everybody would be somebody made this. This didn't happen from, abrasion or erosion or exfoliation or any other natural processes. This is some human handled this rock and shaped it into that shape of an arrowhead. Now, who did it and when and why, I don't know. I may never find out. But still, it is logical to say there was somebody who shaped this arrowhead into this configuration. Another analogy might be if you're walking through the woods and you find a painting hanging on a tree, and you look around, there are no footprints, no people, but here's a painting. And you holler out, hey, who did this? And nobody answers. You still would conclude, it would be the logical conclusion to say somebody painted this thing because this doesn't naturally occur. We know of no processes that would cause a painting to grow on a tree. But yet here's a painting. So I would conclude there was a painter. Design demands a designer. Now, as far as who was that designer, was it Allah or Buddha or Jehovah? That becomes a totally different set of arguments. But getting over hurdle number one, is there a designer at all, I think is intuitive. I think all the evidence that we see through the microscope or the telescope tells us somebody designed all of this. A single hair on a bacteria that's turned by the little motor in the bacteria's skin, the motor is so tiny you could put 8 million of them on the stump of a human hair, and yet they turn 100,000 RPM and can stop in about a quarter of a turn and reverse and go the other way. And the bacteria have some of them all over their body to turn the flagellum. So this is so incredibly designed that I think it's beyond human capability to make such a thing on that small scale. We can come nowhere close to designing anything like this. But yet some look at this and choose to believe that this happened by chance. The bacteria just happens to have these things, and they refuse to admit that there's a designer because that opens up such a giant can of worms for their lifestyle. The Bible says in 2 Peter that the scoffers would be ignorant of the creation and the flood and the coming judgment, and they're willingly ignorant of those things because of their lust. They don't want God telling them what to do. I've never seen an exception to that in the debates I've done. I don't know you guys at all, but I would suspect there is some kind of bent away from wanting to believe in creation because that might put a cramp in your lifestyle that you'd have to be the judge of yourself. But the Bible says, and so the topic was biblical creation. I think it's intuitive there is a creator. Now, is it the biblical one or not becomes another set of arguments. And my job today is to defend the position that the evidence, the things that we observe and see, do indeed support the idea that the Bible is telling us the correct story of how it was created. For example, the Bible clearly teaches that everything, and I mean everything, dinosaurs, everything, was created in 6 days, 6 literal 24-hour days. Jesus said the creation of Adam was the beginning of the creation. So that would have been in the first week. Adam was created with everything else. That's what it says in Matthew 19:4 and Mark 10:6. God wrote on a rock with his own finger and gave it to Moses, the 10 Commandments, and said, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. So I think it's very clear that the Bible teaches everything was made in 6 days. I don't know of any way to explain symbiotic relationships outside of relatively short time period. Like, for instance, plants breathe in the CO2 and give off oxygen. Animals do the opposite. Since we reciprocate the gases, it's logical to say, hey, if one was here for millions of years without the other, they would have used up all of their gas and died off. So the Bible teaches plants made one day, animals made 2 days later, not a problem at all. So the evidence supports what the Bible teaches of a rapid creation, a mature creation, fully formed, fully functioning, fully finished in 6 days. Adam and Eve, mature adults, able to walk, talk, get married first day, not a problem. So I think the evidence that I see, the homologous structures, et cetera, is evidence of a common designer, a really, really, really smart designer, because everything we see in nature is just mind-bogglingly beautiful and complex and designed, and it's just completely illogical to think that any of these things happen without a designer. So that's my position, okay?
Okay. Still have 30 seconds left. Do you wish to forfeit that?
Oh, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kent, for your statement. Chris and John, you guys now have 8 minutes to split amongst yourselves for your opening statement.
All right, Kent, I'm going to go ahead and go first. Once again, my name is Chris Rex. I'm going to start off by addressing a couple of the scientific issues that you just brought up.
Okay.
First off, with the most recent one that you just brought up, talking about the relationship between plants and animals, and the fact that the gases of one, as far as the requirements that plants need, they require CO2. As far as animals, they require O2. And you were mentioning how those two are kind of in tandem with one another, because what we output as animals is CO2, and what plants output is O2. I think the interesting part of what you were saying was how they needed to be created at a similar time in order for us to actually have that kind of happy balance between the creation of O2 and the creation of CO2 and the consumption of either one. But we actually explain this so far as biological evolution is concerned because of the fact that we know that some of the first organisms that evolved were in fact very, very plant-like, and many of which were photosynthetic. And so if we look at a particular kind of one of these photosynthetic plants or algal organisms, we see that in the example of cyanobacteria, these organisms were able to cover the planet virtually and become one of the dominant life forms on the planet, such that they were able to use the massive amounts of CO2 which we had from the early stages of Earth's development. The atmosphere had a lot of CO2 in it, and in fact these particular organisms were able to take that CO2 out of the air and incorporate it into massive amounts of O2. Now, of course, we're talking about several percentage points worth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we're talking about a minimal amount of oxygen in the atmosphere in this early Earth environment. And so what we see over time, I think it was over the span of about 1 billion years or so, is that these photosynthetic organisms were able to create enough O2 that made it sufficient enough in the atmosphere so that we could have the evolution of higher forms of animals. Now, along the way, we have to think about some of the things that also occurred at that time. One is that the formation of large amounts of oxygen in the atmosphere allowed us to start forming an ozone layer that actually protected the planet from significant amounts of solar radiation. This further encouraged the development of higher life forms or more complex life forms because the fact it allowed them to survive the solar radiation. The other thing that happened just coincidentally around that time was that the Earth's magnetic field had actually become enabled at that time, so to speak. So our core finally calmed down and we started to have a controlled spinning of the molten parts of the inner part of the planet. That generated a magnetic field that blocked even more of the solar radiation. Once again, further allowing for evolution to take hold and start creating these massive animals that now dominate the planet. So that kind of addresses that particular point. How am I doing on time, Caleb?
You are at 3 minutes, 25 seconds now.
Okay, I'm going to just briefly cover one more thing and I'll allow you to do the rest. The other thing that you kind of mentioned here that I really just wanted to briefly cover was how you were saying that we need to interpret things very, very carefully, such that we try to distinguish between whether some of these similarities in organisms is evidence of a common designer or a common design, and I absolutely agree with that. I just think that there are certain other pieces of evidence that need to be taken into account other than just looking at things structurally. and that is to say looking at the genetics and how the DNA similarities play into this, and how they kind of paint a bigger picture that all organisms on this planet are related and in fact did descend from a single common organism. All right, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that. Hey, Kent, I appreciate your coming on and willing to defend what I consider to be indefensible. But this is clearly a case of science versus the Bible. What you do is you say science cannot yet explain this or that, and you say, well, my Bible can explain that. Well, science is in its infancy, but what it has done is it's done a lot. This is a New York Public Library desk reference, and it's 700 pages of the results of science. And I doubt that you would disagree much with what's in here, except for perhaps a section on biology, especially evolution. So I want to know why you accept science everywhere, but when it touches on your Bible. It's the Bible that controls your beliefs, not science. So you're masking your beliefs under the umbrella of science when you're not really dealing with science, as Chris mentioned, and as we find in the record and in biology and everywhere. In fact, I want to start off by saying that, quoting Richard Dawkins, whom I'm pretty sure you think is an evil person, or he's trying to lead people astray, and he's not really following the evidence. But listen to this. He's speaking for scientists when he says, evolution is a fact beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. Beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. It is the plain truth that we are cousins of chimpanzees, somewhat more distant cousins of monkeys, more distant cousins still of aardvarks and manatees, yet more distant cousins of bananas and turnips. It didn't have to be true, but it is. We know this because of a rising flood of evidence supporting it. Evolution is a fact. No reputable scientist disputes it, and no unbiased reader will close his book without accepting that. That, of course, is in the introduction to his book, The Greatest Show on Earth. Jerry Coyne, in his book that's out in front of this table, he says, today scientists have as much confidence in Darwinism as they do in the existence of atoms or in microorganisms as the cause of infectious diseases. Evolution is as solidly established as any scientific fact. Because what they're looking at is not what you're looking at. You say it's the same evidence. No, you're not looking at the evidence. You're looking at things that haven't yet been explained. And you're saying, well, so until you can explain everything, then we can't accept evolution at all. And that's how creationists operate. And so then when it comes to explaining their own facts, they use the Bible to do so. But the Bible, and I'm going to show later, I don't even think you understand or take seriously what the Bible says about creation. And what it says about the world and what it says about the flood. I hope to get to that later, because that Bible that you're using as a scientific fact is nothing but. It was written prior to science, and it has nothing in it that can tell us about the origin of the universe if it condones slavery and women as chattel, and as I'm going to show if I have time to do so. I suspect I don't have much more time, but you're not really dealing with science. That's my claim. And science is not a textbook in science. It's science or the Bible, and in that case, I'm going with science every time.
Excellent timing. All right, we will now switch to the next phase of the debate, which will be 2 5-minute rebuttal rounds. Kent, we will begin with you.
Okay, well, I got accused of all kinds of things in that 8 minutes. I don't think I'll have time to cover them all. Maybe we should do this, slice at a time here. I do take the Bible very seriously, and I take science very seriously. The problem is evolution is not part of science. You have to define what you mean by that word evolution. If you mean dogs and wolves are related, i.e. microevolution, then I agree. Evolution is a fact if you're talking about microevolution. But if you think that dogs and bananas are related, and there's evidence for that, you're sadly mistaken or deluded, because there's no evidence. The DNA would fit into the same exact category as the homologous structures of the bones or the organs or any other thing. that could still be the same designer. The lug nuts on a Chevy will fit on a Pontiac. That doesn't prove they both evolved from a skateboard. It proves the same people are designing these cars and using the same parts over and over. I think that the design of nearly all of the animals is stunning. The fact that we have binocular vision in most animals that's amazing. It gives you depth perception, which is not evidence of a common ancestor, but evidence of a common designer. So I resent you saying I'm not looking at the evidence. I'm looking very strongly at the evidence. I'm seeing tons of evidence for what we often call microevolution, and I'm seeing a complete barrier to go beyond that. They get big dogs and little dogs, but they'll never get a dog as small as a flea. There's a barrier in there someplace. There are animals as small as a flea, like a flea, and they'll never get a dog as big as an elephant, even though there are animals as big as an elephant, like an elephant. So I think the evolutionists, I've never had one admit, and I'll ask you guys very bluntly, do you think the variations we see within the species have any limits? Are there any limits at all? Is it possible for an amoeba to turn into a whale over 4.6 billion years? If so, where do you get this? Where does this new information come from? And amoebas are still having babies, well, sometimes by asexual reproduction, but where's the new information coming from? And where's the evidence? The scientific evidence tells us amoebas produce amoebas, and whales produce whales, and dogs produce dogs, and there are no exceptions. Every farmer on planet Earth in the history of the world has counted on evolution not happening and has been correctly rewarded. It doesn't happen. When they crossbreed their cows, they get a cow. When they crossbreed dogs, they get a dog. Now, if you want to believe, I would put a capital B on there and call it a religion. If you want to believe that dogs and whales are related to an ancestor long ago and far away that we cannot see, you can imagine that if you'd like and join SpongeBob, but it's pure imagination. Evolution above the microevolution level is complete imagination. It is a fairy tale for grown-ups. It is a religion that you believe in. As far as Dawkins' quote that evolution is a fact, that is a mantra. You can state that over and over and over again. I mean, the Muslims do this. Allah is the greatest, and the Mormons do this, and the Jehovah's Witnesses do this, and every religion does this. And this is nothing more than the evolutionist mantra. This is an example of the demonstration of your religion to get one of your high priests like Dawkins to say, oh, evolution's a fact, and therefore we're all supposed to bow down and say, oh, wow, it must be a fact because Dawkins said so. I would debate Dawkins or any other evolutionist you can find any day of the week. And I would defy any of you to show me any evidence that any animal has ever produced anything other than its kind. 10 times in the first chapter of Genesis, it says the animals and plants will bring forth after their kind. Pine trees produce pine trees, oak trees produce oak trees. There are no exceptions. There are variations within that kind that allow the creature to survive in different environments, like dogs with thick fur can survive in Alaska and thin fur can survive in the desert, but they're still dog. They're still generally interfertile, though they might reach a stage where, like Chihuahua and Great Dane, they would have difficulty. But they're still the same kind of animal. There are no exceptions, and what you guys have is a complete religion funded by taxpayers in the public school system in violation of the law, I would say. And you need to go start a private school and teach your religion to anybody who wants to learn it, but it's not part of science. I was accused of saying not understanding the reciprocation of the gases and how the early atmosphere had minimal O2. I know that's important to you because of the oxidizing atmosphere would stop any life from evolving. But nobody's ever seen non-living material come alive. It only happens in the textbooks on paper, in some warm little pond someplace. And it's just imagination. Life cannot get started from non-living material. That is called organic evolution, and there's no evidence for it at all. Macroevolution is an animal producing a different kind of animal. There's no evidence for that at all. Microevolution, variations within the kind, that's all that happens, and that's exactly what God said would happen. So I think the biblical account of creation has been supported by all of the observable evidence. All you guys have on your side is imagination and stories and drawing lines on paper.
Excellent. Thank you, Kent. I appreciate that. Okay, guys, it is now your turn for your first 5-minute rebuttal.
Kent, when it comes to the Bible saying kinds produce like kinds, well, you know, that's all they observed. That's all these ancients could tell. That's all they knew, that's all that happened because they didn't observe over the length of time. The theory of evolution, the paradigm of evolution, has not yet been discovered. So of course it's going to say that, but it shows once again that you're really quoting from the Bible and saying that this is how, this is my belief system, regardless of what the science shows. And the science shows overwhelmingly that given 13.7 billion times, see, if you already accept microevolution, good for you. Now all we need is time. Dogs used to be wolves. What could they be next? I don't know. I mean, that's what we see, microevolution, give them time. Now we got puppy dogs. We got all kinds of dogs in our laps and who knows what. That's because we've learned how to manipulate their DNA, and if given enough time, we never know what it could be. But what we've seen is that, just as Dawkins has said, that's how, with time, microevolution turns into macroevolution. And as far as going from non-life to life goes, what you're doing there is a common tactic of saying, well, because evolution doesn't explain everything, we can reject it in total. No, maybe we don't have a theory of how life came from non-life yet, but just like we didn't understand evolution prior to Darwin, we may come to that realization later on as science progresses. So again, it's science versus the Bible, and you're utilizing the Bible to interpret science.
Okay, so I'm going to speak just a little bit more on the topic of taking non-living material and creating life, just because of the fact that does not necessarily deal with evolution per se, even though our general topic is talking about creation. So I will just briefly touch on abiogenesis, because that's really kind of saying that we can take non-living material and have life forms arise from that. The deal with that is that when we look around in the universe, we notice that there are a number of different places in the universe that contain amino acids. Amino acids are actually fairly complex organic molecules that can start founding some of the precursors to life. Now, along the way, we can also find nucleobases, which are an important component of nucleotides, which comprise, of course, our DNA. So if we think about it, what we found in the laboratory, once again, in the laboratory, is that if some of these nucleotides were to be formed, all we would need is 5 of them to randomly come together and form a functional piece of RNA, which would start undergoing processes that are akin to life, which is to say they are capable of organizing materials and actually doing things as an enzyme actually would. Now I'm getting a feedback. The other thing I would like to mention is just briefly touching on the amoeba to whale. Just to reiterate a little bit of what John was just saying, if we think about that process, once again, we are thinking about very, very small changes over time. But even just localizing more on the DNA, like I want to kind of focus more on, just thinking about what you came from. You came from your parents. That doesn't mean that your parents evolved into you, right? So if we think about that, we can actually trace your lineage back in time by tracking the DNA and the relatedness between you and your parents. And we see that you are essentially a mix of 50-50 from your parents. And we can trace those changes in the nucleotide sequences way further back in time. So we can find out your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and who that was. Maybe it was King Louis, whatever. What we can do with that is we can continue that process. Continue that process of looking back in time and looking at nucleotide differences, amino acid differences, and seeing how a number of different organisms are related inherently at some point, which indicates, once again, the theory of common descent, that all organisms on this planet descended from a common ancestor. That's part of the evidence that we're kind of looking at right now, and that we're able to do using genetics, is taking some of this material, this genetic material, and analyzing it, breaking it down, and seeing the differences between different organisms and saying, hey, well, based on our known mutation rates of various different parts of the genome, including various very important biological molecules, like what was previously mentioned in other talks, like something like cytochrome C, we can certainly start creating these types of phylogenetic trees that indicate some sort of ancestry that is common amongst individuals. Oops.
Okay. And that is time. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, Kent, it is now time for your second 5-minute rebuttal. You may begin when ready.
Well, thank you, sir. Yes, he mentioned that, we don't understand how things work, and maybe someday we hope it will work. Well, until you have evidence and proof, I would like you to take it out of the public schools or put it in a religion class instead of a science class. It is not scientific to say that life can come from non-living material. You mentioned that they can create a few amino acids and that sometimes the precursors for life, and you can make nucleotides, and all we need is 5 of these to get together. Again, this isn't science. This is imagination. It's not observable. No one's ever seen this happen. You believe it did. You may believe it very strongly. I think most religious people believe their belief very strongly and, bang on the pulpit even like you guys would do and say this is a fact, like Dawkins did in his, evolution is a fact. Well, you can believe that, but it's not science. It's true, amino acids have been created, but you got a chirality problem. Some are right-handed, some are left-handed. And in order to get a coherent sentence, all your letters have to be facing the right way. Just dropping letters of the alphabet from the sky is not going to form a book. You may accidentally form a small word by dropping letters, and you might accidentally get amino acids to get together in some small series. But the DNA of the human body, or any DNA, is so phenomenally complex that it's like an encyclopedia. Better, more detail, more information than an encyclopedia, all in the like the human DNA. So you can believe this, but it's not science. I think it should be out of schools until then, until it is proven to be science. And you mentioned several times that all you need to do is take these micro changes, and you are so excited that I accept microevolution. I will tell you right now, I don't believe that word is a wise word to use, but microevolution is changes within the same kind of animal. God said that's going to happen 10 times in the first chapter of the Bible and 10 more times in the flood story. God told Noah to bring them into the ark after their kind. It's very clear. 20 times in the first 7 chapters, God said they're going to always bring forth after their kind. There are no exceptions to that. And you mentioned about I'm a result of my parents and the grandparents, etc. But you could go back in my family tree as far as you'd like to go. They're going to be human, obviously human. You have to imagine that it was something non-human in the distant past. And again, this isn't science. This is SpongeBob imagination stuff. It's a religious belief. It's not observable. All we've ever seen is cows produce cows, and they've been farming cows for a long time. And that's all they've ever gotten is cows. Now, if you want to believe that it used to be something different than a cow, that's fine. Believe what you want, but it's not science. And I'm sorry, fellas, you have a religion, even though you think very strongly that you have a science. It is a religious belief that you have. The Bible says very clearly they bring forth after their kind. That's all I've ever seen. That's all anybody's ever seen. If you know of an exception, and I'd like to see it. You certainly couldn't count any fossil as evidence for a change between different kinds.
2 minutes.
Because when you find bones in the dirt, all you know is it died. You could not prove that bone had any children that lived. You certainly couldn't prove it had any children even. Fossils would be no evidence for evolution at all in any honest court of law. They would throw out every single fossil. All I would have to do is say, Your Honor, they found bones in the dirt. You don't know this one had any children. You certainly don't know it had different children. And why would we think a bone in the dirt can do something that no animal today can do, which is produce something other than its kind? So I admire your faith, but I do not admire your science. That you're imagining that these little variations that we see are going to somehow, somewhere, add up to something else. It just doesn't happen. It's never been observed. So adding time is not going to help. Over time, species go extinct. There are no examples of new information being added that is productive to anything. All known mutations are harmful, fatal, or neutral. And if you did somehow, somewhere, get one positive mutation, who's it going to marry? This has to happen twice in the same place, in the opposite sex, and they got to find each other and be interested, or it gets diluted back down. It is just simply nonsense, non-science and nonsense to believe that all life forms are related to a common ancestor. Though I love America, this is the land of the free and the home of the slave. You can certainly have your own religion. That I don't mind, but I do resent you forcing all of us to pay for that in the schools and calling it science when it's clearly not. It is science to say dogs produce dogs. It is not science to say dogs and whales are related. It is pure imagination, SpongeBob stuff. Let's see. Now, there are only, as far as amino acids getting together to form nucleotides and then RNA and DNA, there are so many factors in nature that are set out to destroy this. That's why they had to, with the Miller experiment, they had to isolate it out. When they finally got a couple amino acids, they got to get them out of the system because they'd be destroyed. So I'm sorry, it's a belief system, and I wish you guys would admit it. Okay?
Okay. Well, with that said, thank you, Kent. We will now pass on the ball to John and Chris for their last rebuttal.
Okay, Kent, this once again the New York Science public desk reference. I mean, this is being taught in these things that are in here are being taught in the school system. I mean, that's what science does. In high school, college, they teach these sorts of things. But apparently, you don't want science to be taught in the school when it comes to your holy book, the one you say that tells us that every kind reproduces after itself, even though they were pre-scientific in orientation. Anyone who doesn't understand science would say, yeah, cows produce cows. Of course they do, but given enough time, given microevolution, then you know it does. It just does. You asked for some evidence where this happens. Well, in Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, maybe you've read it, maybe you haven't. They've actually done some tests on, I think, E. coli bacteria. I'm looking the wrong way. And E. coli bacteria, they would take a sample, put it in another test tube, take that one the next day, put it in another test tube, and they did that for years, and they found it to have evolved. They've got evidence of evolution taking place currently, and now if it happens with E. coli, it happens with everything else. And as far as other things go, I mean, it's not just atheists. I mean, you've got all kinds of theists and Christians who disagree with you about these. Methodists, Lutherans, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Catholics as a whole accept evolution. They want to throw theism into it, of course, and we think that's an aberration, of course, but you got even many evangelicals doing that, like Dennis Venema, a biologist at Trinity Western University, Dennis Larimu, you got N.T. Wright, Francis Collins, Carl Giberson, and Richard Colling, and let's see, Kenton Sparks, Conrad Hires, Mark Knoll, Ted Peters, Kenneth Miller. Lots of others it's coming around to the evidence, and here you are, the last holdout. We know, good luck with that. I don't think it's going to work for long. I think you're on the wrong side of history. I think that Augustine is right when he says, at least get your scriptures right, because if you have to go before the infidel, the non-believer, and you don't even get the world right, you don't even get the nature right, you don't even get science right, then you are doing Christianity a disservice. And these people, these Christians, the ones you would disagree with, they think that of you. Just as, I don't care, of course, I'm just saying they think that of you. They disagree vehemently with you. The evidence is there. Evolution is a fact. The only dispute is whether or not there's a God involved or not. Now, you can either accept that or not, but to say that the universe is not as old as astronomy says, and that the Earth is not as old as a geologist says, is really going against science. Science or the Bible. The Bible has been shown to be wrong so many times that it's time to give up the Bible.
Okay. The points I want to quickly hit here, just in our last 2 minutes, you were saying that we have evidence that kinds don't produce other kinds, which is to say dogs have dogs. And yet it's widely accepted, including by you, if I recall correctly, that dogs came from wolves. And no one would argue that a Chihuahua was birthed from a wolf. Nobody would argue that. That is the product of several thousands of years of artificial selection. That is to say that we took one breed of dog or canid and we basically domesticated that over a series of generations. And we did that very, very intentionally. In fact, we're repeating those experiments with foxes in Russia, I believe. And we are showing that the process of domestication actually can happen very, very quickly within just a couple generations, as opposed to requiring 14,000 years to domesticate something. Of course, that's if it's prone to domesticate in general. But anyway, so aside from that point, you also mentioned that all known mutations are harmful and don't necessarily produce anything novel or positive. Now, John briefly touched on that, referring to the E. coli study where they actually developed a new function where they were able to utilize a new energy source for food, which is pretty remarkable because what they showed was that the series of mutations that required were a series of neutral mutations that didn't have any harmful effects. But eventually, they were able to create a positive function. And we have shown that demonstrably in the lab with physical evidence, which makes it real science. The other thing to consider is that when it comes to creating new species, we have seen species of lizards that are normal diploid kind of organism, and then something randomly happens. to where now there all of a sudden is a new species, a triploid species, that is parthenogenic, which is to say it's entirely female in the population composition, and they basically clone themselves. But what we've also seen is that that triploid species, even though that's a new species, has also hybridized with the typical diploid species to create a tetraploid species, which is remarkable to see in any sort of vertebrate. So once again, it has not only created new species once, but twice by hybridizing and creating an even new species by building upon previous species. So in fact, that is evidence of speciation occurring in the modern day.
All right, guys. Well, I want to apologize. I'm getting word from the booth that we're going to have to cut out just a bit early today. We actually had to start a bit late. This is the first show that we've ever run. We had a couple of bugs and kinks to work out. That said, we're going to have to skip the final phase of this debate, which is the closing statements, if that's okay. We can end it on questions and answers, if that's okay with you guys. We can split the remaining...
Do I get a rebuttal to what you just said?
Excuse me, Kent, that was the final rebuttal. That was actually the final round of rebuttals. We were going to be moving on to the 6-minute Q&A session for each side anyway. So what I propose is we, instead of having 6-minute Q&As, we cut that down to 4 because we have 8 minutes remaining in the studio, if that's okay.
4-minute closing statement, is that what you're saying?
Or we can do that too if you prefer, if you want to skip the Q&A. But my suggestion was to do 4 minutes each of Q&A.
Oh, well, whatever you'd like. Okay. He mentioned, both of them mentioned so many things that need to be addressed here.
Okay, well, in that
taming
case...
the foxes, let me ask you a question. The Russian experiment that went for 50-some years, producing domesticated foxes, did they ever get a different kind of animal?
Well, how long were the experiments done? I mean, you know, I don't know of the study, but how long were the experiments done? I mean, you can't all of a sudden just say, well, they had 5 or 10 or 50 years and that's it and that's all they're going to do.
Okay, well, how about with the E. coli? Did they ever get anything other than an E. coli? Or was it still an E. coli? Did they get anything like a hamster or a tomato or a worm? Is it always a bacteria? Did they get a new kind? You slipped in the word species a couple times there. I'm not talking about species, the different species of lizard or different species of, you know, something like that. Is it a new kind of animal? Would anybody in the world recognize it as a new kind, which is what the Bible says, they bring forth after their kind? Was it still a lizard, or was it still an E. coli, or was it still a fox? You guys are grasping at straws.
The word kind is something that we humans label things with, okay? At this point, the differences are enough that now we're going to say it's a different kind. But in reality, it's a continuum. There's enough change there to say that this is taking on a different function. Is it enough to say that, okay, now here's how we're going to label a new species? I don't know that. But we have enough of an evolution there to say that this is taking on a new function. And, you know, give us another 10, 15, 20 years of that, and then we'll see.
Well, I'll go ahead and intervene as moderator. If each side could define their term. You guys, he's complaining that you're using the word species. If you could define the word species. And Kent, if you wouldn't mind, if you would define kind, I think that would be fair.
Okay, well, the Bible says they will bring forth after their kind, so apparently the same kind involves bringing forth, i.e. reproducing. I think dogs and wolves have been demonstrated that they certainly have a common ancestor and came from the common reproducing pair. And the E. coli bacteria would also be the same kind. Now, whether it's diploid or triploid with the, I forget which tree was talking about, I think it was lizards. It's still a lizard, and there's no new information. Going triploid is only a duplication of the existing information already there. It's like if I hand you a book and I say, okay, now here's 5 copies of that book. Oh, wow, that's not new information. It's another copy of the exact same thing. And so an extra copy of the chromosomes is not new information. Where are the examples that you can give of new information that changed something into a different kind of animal? And until you find those examples, you should admit you have a religion. You don't have a science. It's a religion masquerading as science. And if that bothers you, I'm sorry, but that's just a fact.
Well, we'll just have to accept that for what it is. And if you guys, real quickly, if you wouldn't mind defining species. for our audience.
Okay, so just to go back to what you were just saying as far as bringing forth, I think it's important to denote a species as being something that is able to bring forth, which is to say things that are able to interbreed and mate and exchange gene pool information with one another. That's kind of what we're talking about here. And so if we're thinking about kinds, well, we can demonstrably see that a Chihuahua and a wolf are two different kinds because they are not able to interbreed between the two of them for one reason or another. Therefore, if we think about a wolf, once again, it does not bring forth anything but another wolf. And yet you just admitted that we can get Chihuahuas from wolves given A, B, C, D, and a lot of time. And so you've already kind of destroyed your own argument there in saying that one kind only begets the same kind, even though we see that Chihuahuas are different kinds than wolves. And so when we talk about a species, we're talking namely about the biological species concept, wherein one is able to interbreed with the other. And that's why ploidy is important to bring up, because animals of different ploidy typically can't interbreed between one another.
Okay. Well, on that note, guys, I do want to give Kent 30 seconds. I did promise you, Kent, that you would have the opportunity for the last word. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to say whatever you'd like to say, perhaps give you some announcements, present Dinosaur Adventureland if you'd like, and then I'll close out the last 30 seconds of the show if you don't mind. Go ahead.
All right.
You're ready,
Well, the topic was, is there good evidence for biblical creation? I think I won. I think the evidence is overwhelming. The Bible account says they bring forth after their kind, and dogs make dogs and cows make cows. There are no exceptions to that, other than imagination that it might happen if we had more time. So yeah, go to my website, drdino.com, D-R-D-I-N-O, or watch my YouTube every night, Kent Hovind Official, and we answered some of the critics, and we do discuss a lot of things on this topic of creation, the flood, and the coming judgment of God. And I'll see you guys Judgment Day. I would like you to be born-again Christians by then, so keep studying, and maybe you can be a Baptist one day.
Well, thank you very much, Kent. I appreciate you being on our show today. I just want to mention that if you'd like to learn more about We Are Atheists, go ahead and find us on Facebook. Our handle is @WeAreAtheistTV, or you can simply search for We Are Atheists. We are, as mentioned during our introduction, affiliated and sponsored by FreeThought Fort Wayne Incorporated. You may find FreeThought Fort Wayne Incorporated's webpage at freethoughtfw.org. For more information, please check out FreeThought Fort Wayne Incorporated. I want to thank everybody for participating tonight. John and Chris, I want to thank you guys. I want to thank you, Kent Hovind, for joining us today. And I do want to apologize that we had to cut this a bit short. But that's the show. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Anytime. Do it again. Thank you.